This is American Television with Mitchell Hadley. That's Mitch. I'm Dan. We're doing another in our shows on the decades of television. We have arrived at the 2010s, and this is probably going to be the shortest show, at least because I both Mitch and I grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and this was the heart, the meat, and you had the historical stuff that preceded it, but but I know when we did our 2000s show, the first decade of this century, we were sort of talking about the petering out of television as a common ground for people uh, to, talk at the water cooler, as they say. Um, what struck you first off about the decade? What were there any major innovations? I mean, we know that there was the slow merger of Netflix and the internet with television and whatnot. What is the thing that stands out about last decade?
Well, what's interesting about it from a particular perspective is that we have what some people have referred to as a second golden age of television. Now, we've talked about the golden age in general, and that we're not sure that there ever was a true golden age, let alone a second golden age. But what I find interesting is that you've got this period of transition where we're really leaving the first part of the century and we're getting into the 2020s. And so, in a way, we've got this peak of prestige TV, which we'll be talking about. But at the same time, we can already see the television is laying the groundwork for its own demise. All the technology that makes the 20 teens possible is what leads to the downfall of the 2020s. And I think that when you look at it in that way, that's probably going to overpower any of the individual shows as being the most important cultural factor in the decade.
So I was watching an interview series that came up. It's actually called The Magnificent Others with Billy Corgan, the guy who was the founder and lead singer of the Smashing Pumpkins back in the 1990s. And apparently he owns a pro wrestling outfit, a small outfit, and he's doing these interviews with musicians and actors and whatnot. I saw a bit of an interview he did with Mary Lou Hanna from Taxi earlier, and in one of his shows, he was talking with an actor. I forget whether it might have been Mickey Dolenz or it might have been Barry Williams from the Monkees and Brady Bunch, respectively. And he was still pushing the line about how uh, last decade, the 20 teens or tens, was such a golden decade compared to stuff in the 60s and 70s, which would be odd considering that both Dolenz and Williams were in the 60s and 70s in television. And I thought it kind of odd because he was mentioning all these shows that I'd never even heard of.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I heard of The Sopranos. I knew Mad Men. I knew Breaking Bad. The top 8, 10, 12 shows I know, even though I've only seen a handful of episodes over the years of them. But he's mentioning all these shows, and I was thinking, so you're talking though about this again to either Dolan's or Williams. Williams, whose show has been in rerun heaven, maybe surpassed only by I Love Lucy and Sherwood Schwartz's other show, Gilligan's Island, or the Monkees, who are the greatest example next to or equal to the Partridge Family of what television could do in the realm of music. And you're talking about shows that probably get maybe 1.2 million viewers an episode. And certainly that has nothing to do with the quality. But I think it shows how utterly detached people are, because a little bit later I want to read a list of some of the shows that I have no idea what they are about. Uh, what do you think about all of this critical stuff on how great these shows are, how as you said, the prestige television, but yet maybe 2% of the public knows anything about them? Any 2% of any of those given shows?
Well, I think that's really an interesting question, and it points sort of to what we're seeing in the teens, that the market is already beginning to fragment, not in the way that it is today, but it's already you're getting this idea of prestige television being on cable as separate from broadcast. And although it's very difficult for some of us to recognize this, there was always a sizable minority of people who never got cable. And we might be talking about 30% of the population. I'm just throwing that out. But there was a sizable minority who never bothered with cable at all. They only got over the air.
Hmm.
And so
You're looking
when
at
you're
them.
talking,
You're looking at one of that 30%.
yes. Well, we had cable, but mostly what we watched it for were movies, sports, and the news. Even when, and we had cable through the teens. And so that's kind of why I'm making this point that there were people who didn't have cable at all. And for them, these shows, even if they're on basic cable as opposed to pay cable, these shows are a mystery. And then you've got people like me who did have cable but didn't watch most of the channels that were on there. I didn't bother with AMC or Lifetime or A&E or any of these other boutique channels. I was going with ESPN and CNN and TCM and even MTV back at one point in time. But you've already got a situation where you are divorcing as much as 30% of the public from who decides what is popular television. Then you add into that you've now got, and I think that there's a number that I wrote down here, something like 540 scripted shows on cable television, in addition to what you have on the over the air networks. So now you've not only got a multiplicity of choices, some of which are self editing because people won't pay for it, but for the people who do pay for it, you've now got, instead of maybe 50 shows, you've got 500, 600 shows. So you've got a multiplicity of shows as well. And so I think that we have talked about this in some of our other programs. You'll never see a show like the Beverly Hillbillies that pulled down 40% of the audience on a given night, that just had astronomical viewing numbers. But by the same token, you will never see a program that was reasonably critically reviewed and well thought of, that had a viewing audience that today would be considered dominant, that would be canceled because it was down at the bottom of the ratings. So we've completely changed how we look at TV. And because of that, I think that we've got an audience now in the teens that is more susceptible to word of mouth, to what the critics are talking about, to what the accepted story, if you will, is. And we're told that there's prestige TV. We're told that Mad Men is a show you can't miss. We're told that Breaking Bad is breaking barriers. We're told that Game of Thrones is the next level of adventure television. And so we're curious, we tune in, we watch it, maybe we stay with it, maybe we don't. But we wind up producing numbers that would have gotten you laughed off of television in the 60s and 70s. So I think that just by changing the methodology and the delivery, we've automatically changed the perception of television so that it becomes very easy for a show to become a hit with people like you and me never having heard of it, and people who are far less invested in TV than the two of us having no idea what you're talking about.
Well, I think I had mentioned this many shows ago. Uh, it's not just the audience factor, but when I was born in 1965, I believe the population of the United States was something around 165 to 175, 180 million,
That's
something in
about
that
right,
area.
yeah.
Now it's literally about double, give or take a couple of million. Uh, so back when I was born, we had three networks. We had maybe a handful of independent shows, of syndicated shows, mostly that came over from England. The stuff with Patrick McGowan's, the Avengers, that kind of stuff. Um, And as you said, now there are 500 scripted shows. This doesn't include the Real Housewives. This doesn't include, all the faux reality shows, the game shows, the this that, which would take up maybe not the creative people, but the people with the camera work and all the little things that
Yeah,
make a show go.
takes up the bandwidth.
So you're talking about a population that has doubled, but the product is 100 times what it was. So you're talking, you have 1/50th of the talent being spread out thinner. So
Yep.
you're not going to get a Bob Newhart show or Mary Tyler Moore show where the fifth or sixth most known character is played by a brilliant actor. You're not going to get a lot of great television directors because maybe there's only 10 or 12 of them out there, and that would be fine if you were just looking at prime time 3 network television 50, 60 years ago. But now, anyone, they can pull someone from the cafeteria who is flipping pancakes and say, "Can you direct the show?" Um, and then to be told when I watched Mad Men, the first 3 seasons, the last couple of seasons, I just got sick and tired of it. I've seen half a dozen Breaking Bads, maybe a dozen Sopranos, and there are moments there, but the way that people, even like this Billy Corgan on the show with Dolans or Williams, whoever it was he spoke to, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. I really don't. Are there some good performances? But is Breaking Bad really that much better than the Rockford Files, if at all? I mean,
Well, I
I
think,
come back to that kind of thing.
yeah, I think you've raised a really good point, and this is a thought that is not original to me, so I'm not going to take credit for it. I will take the blame if I don't make it very well. But part of, I think, what we're seeing too is how society is reacting to storytelling. By the teens, we've gotten a really cynical culture. We've gone through all kinds of scandals. We have gone through all kinds of phases where we've seen that things don't wind up uh, delivering what they promised. And so we have a cynical audience as well. And whereas in the day, you talked about sophistication, as people would define Cary Grant as the essence of sophistication. And Grant had a certain ironic detachment from what was going on around him. Part of his very sophisticated nature was being able to maintain a certain distance from all the madness that was happening around him. That's how we viewed the concept of sophistication in the 40s and 50s. By the 20 teens, I think we've come into a completely different definition of sophistication, and we've come into a different definition of irony. Irony now means looking at all the traditional values and the traditional things that we used to take for granted and giving it kind of the evil eye, saying that, well, you know, a religion is just as corrupt as any other institution. Politicians are more corrupt than we ever thought they could be. The police force is comprised of crooks. You have all of these different illusions that have been dashed. And therefore, whereas Grant epitomized a certain kind of sophistication, in the teens, you now have a different definition of sophistication. It becomes identified with a certain kind of moral ambiguity. And a lot of the shows that we see in the teens that emphasize this kind of ambiguity, like Breaking Bad or the Wire, The Shield, The Sopranos, different things like that, where you have the anti-hero, not as an unconventional hero, but as somebody who's actually got at least one arm and a leg in the over the line into being a criminal. You've got these anti-heroes now, but it becomes easier to identify them with them because the establishment itself has been discredited. So sophistication now means being able to accept ambiguity. Irony becomes more of a posture than a tool, something to be bragged about. And I think that the result is that you get these shows that are very dark in temperament, not to mention cinematography, but we'll talk about that later maybe. But you get them that are very dark in temperament, where you don't have any traditional heroes anymore, where cynicism and irony are the overriding components of the storytelling, and where at the end of the day, the more complex, the more ambiguous it becomes, the more it is seen as telling a sophisticated, intellectual type of story. We don't fall for simple solutions. Everything has to be made complicated. And so I think that that is what that's what ultimately happens, is that the opinion shapers and the decision makers within the industry have been allowed to redefine what the categories, what the standards are for quality television, and they've been redefined into a way that, quite frankly, for me, and I think for you as well, results in less interesting TV. That's a very sociological definition of it, and I don't know if it's entirely transferable over into the industry itself. But you got to think that the people who are making the decisions, the showrunners, the writers, the producers, the network executives, are all part of this ecosystem, and they are feeding off of each other in that way, so that it continues to multiply. And pretty soon the only kind of show that becomes acceptable is one that plays into this kind of nihilistic idea of what life is really about. And if you were introducing a show like, oh, either, well, I think someday we'll talk about what they've done to Little House on the Prairie in the reboot. But I'm thinking of a show like Highway to Heaven, where you had a really basic concept of good and evil, and people being able to do good, not to do well, but to do good. That would be laughed at by a large segment of the population, of the decision makers now, because they would be convinced that there's an ulterior motive somewhere involved in that. And I think that by nature has to have affected how they go about telling stories and how we go about consuming what we're seeing. Is it any wonder that the audience becomes fragmented and turned off by this kind of thing and goes looking for alternate forms of entertainment when this is what they're barraged with on a daily basis?
So the term that was used and that you used was prestige television, but that's usually been used to describe cable shows. The network
Mhm.
shows seem to have fallen into a few categories, starting at the turn of the century. And by the 2010s, it seemed to be fairly rigid. You'd have Friday nights or Saturday nights, Sunday nights, you'd have the game show stuff, America's Funniest Videos, which has been around sort of almost as long as The Simpsons. Uh, you'd have uh, the WB, CW kind of shows that had young people. I remember there was one show about 8, 9 years ago I saw, which had one of my favorite actresses, Megan Follows, playing a French queen with a bunch of young, good-looking mannequin people that couldn't act their way out of that out of a bag. That's a typical CW show. Then
Yep.
you'd have sports, and then you'd have sort of these holdover shows, or these shows that were copies of copies of copies. The Big Bang Theory, which seemed to be a third-rate Friends, and I wasn't too hot on Friends when I saw it. You'd have Grey's Anatomy, which I guess is now about 25 years into its run,
Yeah.
and it's been.
Mhm.
You'd have the CSI, ABC, all the it's like FDR's alphabet soup organizations, all of these shows, and they're all the same. I saw
Yeah.
one just recently, and this is in the 2020s. Special services or something, Tennessee. A fire. It had the commercial on the show, a fire tornado, and it's like I've heard of them, but I don't think that they happen in downtown Memphis or wherever the hell it was said. And it just seems that even if we were to grant that cable television on the whole is the best that television has produced, I won't grant that, but let's assume that.
Assuming, yeah,
If we look at the networks, they went violently into the crapper.
they did. And I think that I mean, I have a couple of theories on that. I think that as prestige television continued to grow. And I agree with you on that description too, but we'll let it slide. As prestige television continues to grow in cable, um, broadcast television has to strive for the broadest possible audience. They're still clinging to what may be an outmoded measurement of success, which is total viewership. Yes, they have broken it into different areas where they're talking about demographics, they're talking about age, region, socioeconomic factors like that, but they're still looking at raw numbers. And a show like NCIS maintains its popularity far more so than any show that you see on cable. Now, that creates a trend in cable where it starts to become selective. Would you rather be one of 36 million people or one of 2.5 million people watching a really cool show? Well, if 2.5 million suggests that it's almost a curated audience. And people would like to be part of that. So I think that suggests its appeal. But let's set that aside and turn to the flip side of that, which is populist TV for the masses. And if you remove quality television from broadcast, which you essentially do if you cede the quality label over to pay TV, what you're left with by definition is going to be schlock. And knowing how broadcasters love imitation, they love to hang on to their intellectual properties, and so you get different. I keep waiting for NCIS Sahara because eventually you're going to put it in Omaha, you're going to put it in British Columbia, you're going to put it all over the world where there is no water and there is no navy whatsoever, and it's because you've got a reliable, dependable formula and you have four letters that everybody recognizes. So if you like the original NCIS, you know exactly what you're going to get in its offspring. Now, that becomes, I think, important to the networks because it means that it's a safer gamble. They're dealing with a known quantity in IP. They're also dealing with an increasingly small number of showrunners and developers who are not working in the prestige TV areas. And so they become dependent upon a smaller group to produce a larger quantity of programming. So is it any wonder that skipping ahead to the 2020s, you've got Chicago Fire, Chicago Hope, Chicago PD. You've got all of these coming out of the same studio, the same stable, and they all look alike. And people seem to like that. And you can question what it is about these shows that people like, but unquestionably, for a certain segment of the population, this becomes comfort TV. Now, my friend David Hofstede has a comfort TV website where he talks about the past, about shows from our era, and he's extremely eloquent when he's talking about the concept of comfort TV. So I'm not using it in the same way that David does. I would say it's maybe junk food TV because what it's doing is filling you with empty calories. And I think that plays a big part of it. They have no incentive to make good TV if they can still get the ratings. Then you push that out of the way. You bring in the reality TV. You bring in unscripted TV. You've got your game shows. You've got your talent shows. You've got your primetime sports, and all of a sudden you're able to fill up your schedule without having to work very hard at it.
So let me give you two examples of shows, network shows from the 2010s and also from 30 or 40 years before. The first one I think I've mentioned before on a show was the remake of Hawaii Five-O. The original was from 68 to 80. I think the remake was somehow from the early teens and lasted about 4 years. It was so bad that they had originally recorded an updated version of the classic da, 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 da. And apparently by season two, people wanted the old sound back. They brought it back. But the characters were again played mostly by mannequins. If you look at, I mean, yes, the old Hawaii Five-O, especially in the first two or three seasons, had a couple of the yellow face cringe moments, but that's aside from that stuff that was culturally beyond the show that just seeped in. the actors were much better. You had native actors from Hawaii of assorted backgrounds. They were not necessarily handsome. A lot of them were chunky. A lot of the Hawaiian guys were chunky. The only guy who was like undoubtedly good looking was the big, tall, lean white guy, McGarrett. But still, when you compare it to the Barbie dolls that they had on that new version of it, I mean, it was ridiculous. I want to though talk though. Now I want to talk about an actor who was huge in the '80s, Tom Selleck. And I didn't watch Magnum PI in its initial run. I remember though in the early O's when I was unemployed for about 6 months, changing jobs. I watched back to back episodes. I think it was on WGN Superstation that we got in
That
in
makes sense.
Minneapolis
Yeah.
then, and I was like, man, I was biased against it because I liked the Rockford Files and I didn't like the
Hmm.
Tom Selleck character on there, and so I didn't. But he was a terrific actor. He could do a little bit in a wink. He wasn't just a hunky guy for the women. He was a good actor. Then I saw at work sometimes on a break a few years ago. I saw probably 4 or 5 full episodes of Blue Bloods, his show from a decade ago. I don't know if it's still running. And boy, I mean, he was like the mummy. His acting was so on. Yes, he's 30 years older now or whatever it was, but everything was lit dark and blue.
Yeah.
It looked like they were in the goddamn Bat Cave. And every
Mhm.
the episodes I saw, oh, Lieutenant Cowley went rogue. We got to bring him down. Oh, there's a traitor in the department. Oh, there's a terrorist threat. Minor actor, H gets killed off. He's the red shirt of the show. They'd have that every so. And I was just stunned at how badly acted it was. And I'm not. And again, yeah, yes, I don't expect the 75-year-old Magnum PI or however old he was at the time to be as spry and nimble and darling with the women as his 40-year youngest self. But there's no way anyone being honest could look at Blue Bloods and look at Magnum PI and not say that PI was the better show and that Selleck was a much better character and a much better actor than his later self. And yet, with those kinds of shows, that's all you hear. Oh, he's brooding now. Why does a character have to be brooding? Why does
Yeah.
everything, again, I don't know, go take it
Well,
if you can.
you're now you're throwing me some softballs that I think I can really hammer at here. There are a number of factors here, and I'll try to tick them off one by one because any one of them could make an entire show for us probably. But one of the things with a show specifically like Blue Bloods or NCIS or these procedural shows, one of the things you've got is what I call the police state wet dream, which is that after 9/11, when Homeland Security became a real thing and the terrorist threat was a real thing, we began to glorify these ideas of these security people who were out there taking care of us, protecting us. And in the name of that, anything they do is permissible because they're only going to pick on the bad guys. We know that. That's the way TV works. And if you're a good guy, you don't have anything to worry about. If you haven't committed a crime, you don't have a thing to worry about. Well, we all know that that's BS. But that plays into this police state wet dream that you'll see in shows like SVU or some of the more extreme versions where you really see the police hammering away at it. That becomes a very popular motif in anything like this. So in talking about Blue Bloods, you're identifying those very core elements that they're out to get, these kinds of people. Now you add to that what you were talking about, the color palette, which is dark and brooding because we live in dark, brooding times. Bright television. You remember, you could talk about I Dream of Jeannie, you could talk about Bonanza, how remarkably colorful everything was. I tell you, if you want to see color sometime, watch a Christmas special from the late 50s or early 60s, any kind of a variety show, whether it's the Bell Telephone Hour or Tennessee Ernie Ford, and they start to do what they imagine a Dickens Christmas looked like. And it takes full and complete advantage of the color palette on there. It is dazzling to watch these kinds of shows. now there's a certain segment of viewership that would look at that as being, again, I hate to use the word, unsophisticated. It's cartoonish. It's silly. What right do you have to introduce these bright, happy colors into a dark, depressing, brooding era? We've somehow managed to identify. Somebody said Prestige has an aesthetic vocabulary of its own, and that goes from anything from the dark camera work to this natural mumblecore type of acting where you've got to have captions on there, even if they're speaking in English, just to understand what they're saying. You've got anti-heroes, you've got the ambiguity of morality, and you've got serialization, you've got grim subject matter. All these things are now seen as trademarks of things that are so sophisticated. And this is precisely when you're talking about the difference between Magnum and Blue Bloods. There's a whole pack of them right there. Magnum would be kind of an unsophisticated show. Look, he's goofy. He wears silly looking shirts. He mugs a little bit for the camera. He has that voiceover narration that's telling you, don't really take what you're seeing too seriously. Well, damn it, we want to take our television seriously now. This is a serious time. How dare you make light of what we're doing? I think these people are just stuck in this kind of a mentality. Someone like James Garner would never be able to do Rockford or Maverick or some of the great work he's done because he's so real and he's so genuine and he is so warm. But those are all attributes that we don't seem to want anymore in our shows. And I think you're absolutely right about Selleck in that he's not going to have what he had when he was Magnum anyway. But I suspect that Selleck is looking at this from the standpoint of, I'm getting a really nice paycheck. I'm not having to carry the whole show by myself. Other than, I imagine that's why I don't know that he's very invested in the character, but to the extent that he is, I suspect he's really being handcuffed by what they want that character to be. We want him to be the antithesis of Magnum. And I suspect that for what he's seeing as the benefits to playing the character, he's more than willing to go along with that.
Well, getting back to what I said about 50 times as much entertainment being put out there by watering down the pool. In a few of the episodes of Blue Bloods, it's not only that the premises were trite, but we're having a conversation over a big wooden desk in Selleck's office. Oh, Selleck, this character. Selleck, this character. There's no innovation. There's nothing stylistically that sets the show apart. And I remember an episode of Magnum PI. It opens up with Magnum floating in the ocean on a board. His boat got capsized. And the whole episode is him remembering. So it's a bright, beautiful day. He's floating on the board. By one of the commercial twists, you see the shark fins going around. Nowadays, you'd have to see, stock footage of the sharks there in the dark water and lunging at his, and you'd see gratuitous blood going up. But he's there, and then we contrast that with his friends, the British guy, the black fellow helicopter pilot, and one or two other people. They're going nutso. They're talking with the harbor master. They need to get a boat out there. The helicopter guy is going around looking for Magnum, and throughout all of that, we have as you said, we have his voiceover, and his voiceover. There are sometimes when we get little moments of he think this is the hero of the show. Am I going to make it or not? And the way he delivers it is not what you would expect. The setup is not what you would expect for a show with a guy who's a 6'4" or 5, 230-pound buff, hunk for the housewife set. And yet you get some of the dog, you get some of his own self-doubts creeping. I forget why he was there. I might have been going after a bad guy or something, but that doesn't really matter. It's the fact that they put him in a unique situation, a situation where he has to depend on his friends. He can't be the hero. He has to be helped by his friends there. So it's important that we know that Magnum is a nice guy, that he could get a half a dozen people to stir up the Coast Guard to go looking for him or whatever it was. You don't, but and you compare that with Blue Bloods, it's face, face, face.
Yeah.
Well, there's no innovation. That yeah. So
Innovation, you make a really good point about innovation, because I would contrast something like this with what I think was one of the most innovative shows ever on TV, which is Twin Peaks. The Twin Peaks had its highs and lows, and its lows were very low. But when you look at the episodes, particularly in the reboot, or I shouldn't call it a reboot, the revival of it, where you've got someone like David Lynch who knows how to make a movie, and you see those techniques applied to television, you're not going to get any of the kinds of static scenes that you're talking about. What you're really getting when you talk about these, not specifically in the case you're talking about, but I liken this to, there was a show called Homicide that, I think, in the 90s. I could be wrong about that, but what it did was present kind of a cinema verite version of television, where everything looked like it was being shot with handheld cameras. Everything was jiggly. Everything was naturalistic. So again, you've got natural lighting. You've got everything that's being dark. And there is a certain pride being taken in the lack of any style in the show. So whereas Lynch takes these remarkable chances where you see scenes for 5 or 6 seconds, he's focusing on a ceiling fan just going around and around and around, and which I just blew me away the first time that I saw that in the pilot. That would be considered outre now, because it draws attention to itself. It's not naturalistic. And I think that this is something else that has happened with television nowadays, is that you don't reward any kind of creativity. You almost want the antithesis of creativity. You want everything followed to this grim, simple, no frills type of television, which is, as you say, it's deadly dull. But you go and you watch an episode of Perry Mason from the 50s, even the early 60s, and you'll see some incredible framing shots in that. I remember that there's one episode where all of a sudden it looks like they're getting a crane shot that almost approximates coming down from the ceiling of the courtroom, looking down on the judge, the prosecutor, the defense, the witness box, the onlookers. For the time, it's an incredibly sophisticated and creative shot. Now, I think that there is a push against that kind of thing. You probably see them, but you see them for a different reason and in a different context. And again, I think what it amounts to is that we don't reward creativity. We don't reward it in terms of acting, writing, or directing.
It reminds me of the difference between, and I'll use a movie example. 19, was it 68 or 69? Once Upon a Time in the West, the opening shots of the three guys
Mm-hmm.
waiting for Charles Bronson to come at the station. These are three killers, hired killers. They spend the first 8, 9 minutes, whatever it is, just sitting at the train station waiting for Bronson. Then Bronson gets off, they go, and they ride. It's a perfect buildup there, and the outcome, again in broad daylight, shows you the grimness of the human condition, but also how funny it is. Compare that to 30 years later, the Blair Witch kind of thing, where
Mm-hmm.
cinema verite, it's constantly dark, shaky cameras, blah 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 blah. Oh,
Yeah.
in the back there's a body. Isn't that scary? No. How am I going to be scared? If you're giving me vertigo, I'm going to be puking. I'm not going to be scared.
Yeah, that's precisely it. And again, maybe I'm showing an incredible lack of creativity in saying this. That's certainly possible. But I keep coming back again and again to these same words, whether we're talking about sophistication or a fragmented audience or irony being, I would call it posturizing, posing. But you have these certain touchstones that are becoming part of the aesthetic of the new television of prestige TV, and you have an increasingly small number of people who are communicating this to the public. Let's look at what reviews are like today. You don't have very many famous TV critics anymore. You don't have a Cleveland Amory. You don't have a Judith Crist. But you don't even have Tom Shales. You don't even have I forget what his name was with the Chicago Tribune. Rick somebody. I want to say Rick Dees, but I know it isn't that. But my point. Yeah, my point is that the New York Times had all newspapers had respected TV critics who wrote seriously about TV and were taken seriously. You don't have that anymore. You either have online critics who most of them are not qualified to be critics, and the ones who get the most attention are either producing clickbait or rage content or provocative headlines or what have you, but they're not really doing anything that I would call very creative or very interesting. And the result of all this, I think, is again, you've got fewer people telling a larger population what is and what isn't good. And so after a while, it becomes an echo chamber. And when they don't like what they hear, when you've got viewers saying, "We don't want this kind of TV. This crap. We don't want to see this." Well, then it's their fault. It's the fault of the viewer for not appreciating what they have, for not being again sophisticated enough or intelligent enough to understand what they view as the way to portray the human condition, which is almost invariably bleak. There is no such thing as the human comedy anymore, because I think it's inconceivable that you could find that kind of dichotomy in regular everyday life according to these people. So I think that until you get a more egalitarian way of content out there, and yes, I before anybody brings this up, yes, I know that we have more critics than ever before. The internet has made everyone a film critic. Everyone's a TV critic. Yes, there are more opinions than ever before, but how many of them are read by any significant number of people? I would say that you have a difference now between critics and, although I hate to use the word, influencers. And the number of influencers who really have influence is far less than what it used to be. And if those influencers are all talking to each other and preaching in an echo chamber, then you're going to get a uniformity of opinion, which is going to translate into a uniformity of what you see out there, because the influencers are the ones that the programmers listen to. And if they're all from the same incestuous group to begin with, then they're all going to produce the same kind of quality. That may be very simplistic, but I do think that there's a lot to it, that there's no diversity of thought or opinion or anything on what this should be. Television, somebody said that the real point at which time television lost its true identity was when television stopped becoming entertainment and started becoming content. Once you view television as a commodity rather than a form of entertainment, or even more broadly speaking, a form of communication, when it becomes content, that's such a dehumanizing word. And what else are you going to wind up with besides dehumanizing programming? The Sopranos, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, Game of Thrones, some of the shows that we haven't gotten into, but that are really the touchstones of the 2010s. They all have these same things in common. They all have anti-heroes. They all have moral ambiguity. They all have dark color palettes. They all have brooding intensity. They all have serialistic qualities to them. They all have, or many of them at least, have some pretty big stars in it, which is the one area of prestige TV that I will grant is that we saw the lines blurred between movie stars and TV stars in the teens. You saw some real crossover as to some big names that were doing big TV shows. But again, it almost became more of the auteur type of programming than any kind of programming for audiences. And when and what's left, what are the dregs of TV? The shows that are left are the ones that mop up with the big ratings that, as we have discussed, wind up not being very good.
Yeah, I don't know if I dislike the way the term content is used more or less than the word creative, as if it's a noun rather than an adjective. So I looked online earlier today, and there's a website called TV Line that has a 3-day old article called 15 Most Underrated TV Shows of the 2010s Ranked. And I want to just give it what the name is, what the picture suggests that it is. You can look at it on TV Line, but and then you tell me if you ever heard of it or anything, because I just want to get a sense out of 15. I would think that a fellow as well versed in TV like you would probably know 14 or 15 out of the 15 if this was 50 years ago, but we'll see. So the first show is something called Black Sails, which seems to be a pirate show.
Never heard of it.
The same.
What was what station network was it?
Let's see. I don't know if it says so. Stars.
Okay.
Stars with a Z.
I'll grant you I've heard of Stars, but never heard of that, even in passing.
And now we have something else with the word black in the title. Orphan Black, which was held back by confusion of its identity. Early trailers for the Canadian-produced BBC America series pictured as a crime thriller about a criminal played by breakout star Tatiana Maslany stealing her dead doppelganger's identity.
I have heard of that one, but you know why? Because it was on BBC America at the same time as my favorite show, Top Gear. So I kept seeing commercials for it during Top Gear. I got to where I understood the concept. Did I ever see an episode of it? No.
Okay, number 13, Person of Interest. Essentially a proto-prestige sci-fi drama wearing the comfort mask of CBS police procedural. That disguise became a point of tension between Nolan and the network. CBS wanted a case of the week series about Jim Caviezel fighting crime, while Nolan saw the premise as a jumping off point for high concept crime fighting.
I've only heard of it. I wouldn't have even been able to tell you that much.
Number 12, Banshee. Cinemax's more infamous reputation hurt it. The series development in the early 2010s, the premium cable platform was still widely known as Skinemax. So Banshee and uphill. So that looks like a cop show. Banshee.
Never heard of it.
Okay. Number 11, with the creative title of Chuck. Chuck has been one of the more fascinating survival stories for the list for two reasons. One involves the sandwich franchise throughout its 5-season run on NBC, so this was network. Chuck was rarely far from cancellation. Warner Brothers produced it, starring Zachary Levi as a retail employee who gets roped into the CIA.
I've heard of it. I wouldn't have recognized the description, though.
Number 10, Party Down, P-A-R-T-Y, Party Down. A mythically unpopular show for a 2-season run on Stars in 2010. It only drew 74,000 viewers for its finale. John Enbom essentially accepted that it had no future with the network. And let's see, Party Down was a cult favorite after cancellation. It's a unique, bleak look on the lives of struggling artists in Los Angeles, depicting them as overlooked geniuses, depicting them not as overlooked geniuses, but as frogs boiling pots of quiet mediocrity.
Nope, I can't say that I got that one on the playlist.
Number 9, as in the dog, Terriers, plural, Terriers. FX show The network's chairman held a conference about the cancellation of Terriers to impress upon journalists that the show was not an obvious victim of marketing malpractice. Uh, it featured many mangy canines prominently, so they could assume Terrier some kind of dog drama. Uh, so I don't know what the hell it was supposed to be. Something against, I guess, with cops and dogs. I don't know.
Sounds like it's for the dogs.
Yeah. Number 8, Channel Zero. So this was made by someone named Kane Parsons, a creepy pasta type thing. Uh, Channel Zero was positioned for an underwhelming performance on Sci-Fi, the network better known for fast-paced, lore-heavy genre hits than the tight serialized and cinematic miniseries. So this was some kind of horror kind of show on Sci-Fi.
Yeah, never heard of that.
Number 7, High Maintenance. This was on HBO, created by Ben Sinclair. The network picked up the series in 2016, boldly chose to maintain its defining anthology format in the vein of Black Mirror, which I have heard of. But so I guess this was sort of a variant on the Outer Limits, Twilight Zone kind of thing.
Yeah, I can't say it rings a bell.
Number 6, Halt and Catch Fire. AMC. Halt and Catch Fire was the last of the AMC Prestige shows, one of the greatest series the network produced. AMC hit the first season of Halt and Catch Fire. The main characters felt like remixes from Breaking Bad and Mad Men. The true show. Okay, so this was another cop kind of show, Halt and Catch Fire.
I have heard of it, and that one sticks with me only because it struck me at the time as being such a peculiar title.
Yeah. Number 5, The Leftovers. Seems like a cop show as well. Damon Lindelof co-created the series with author Tom Perrotta, adapting Perrotta's novels after finishing Lost. So I guess this is Lost meets a cop show.
Well, it's an interesting concept, but the best I can say about that is that the title sounds vaguely familiar.
Okay, number 4, You're the Worst. Banshee wasn't the only series on the list that could use a lift from the boys. This dark romantic comedy starring Aya Cash opposite Chris Gia, with a pair playing LA lovers spiraling toward a toxic relationship.
No.
I mean, you've got the Kardashians. What do you need a fictionalized version of that?
Yeah, exactly.
Number 3, Legion. Few superhero shows have been as radically energizing effects as Legion. So this is more like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So I guess this was something like a second-rate The Boys, if you know what that was.
I've heard of it. I can't even tell you why I have. If I read it as a tie-in to another show or something, but it's come across the radar, and that's about the best.
Okay, this number 2 is just the word review. In an era before our current post-2020 state, review was prescient. Andy Daly stars as Forrest McNeil, a man dedicated to reviewing all of his life's experiences for a virtual audience. So I guess this is like the Jim Carrey thing, the Truman Show.
Yeah,
something like
it sounds sort of like it. Yeah, I might have heard. I certainly don't recognize the title. I might have heard the concept, but not the title.
And the last one, number 1, Rectify. Rectify is without a doubt in the conversation for the most underrated TV show of all time. It may be the least widely seen series on the list. Sundance TV original follows a man who is released from prison after spending his life awaiting execution on death row. Crime thriller. In reality, the series was impossibly textured, nuanced character study. Yeah. Okay. So it looks like you heard of about a third of the shows, but you didn't watch any of them.
I didn't watch any of them, and I would say that if I didn't have an insatiable interest in keeping up with some of the various aspects of pop culture, I probably wouldn't have heard of half of the third that I had heard of, and certainly none of them sound interesting enough to me to want to watch them.
And probably 12 or 13 of the 15, again, dark comedies, dark this, dark that, as if that's all depth. So, unless you have something to say, I do want to move on to a couple of other areas of
Yeah,
television.
that's good.
Okay, so we talked in earlier shows, and especially I think in the 1980 show, about the rise. The 80s was sort of the golden age of soap operas. There were, 12, 13, 14, 15 soap operas on the three main networks. This was the era of All My Children and Its Social Relevance, General Hospital and its high flying Luke and Laura adventures. It was the age where you had shows like Young and the Restless came to dominate at the end. And then by the 2010s here, we saw the absolute nadir. We saw in 2011 the end of All My Children. In just a few months later, the end of One Life to Live, leaving General Hospital as ABC's only show. I think you had CBS had Bold and Beautiful and Young and Restless, Days of Our Lives. So you only had four network soap operas after the last 60 or 70 years where you had something like 12 to 15 at any given time. Now they've added one an all black, well, majority black cast, the Gates I think it's called. But uh, any comments on why the 2010s were so hostile to the soap opera format?
I would make a couple of guesses. I think number one would be that we'd already seen soap operas move into prime time where they could have been more valuable, and we've also seen the rise in reality television, which is by definition soap opera-ish. But also, what you've seen in the 2010s is the start of the network pullback from broadcasting during the day. You look at originally one of the things that was most striking when the Fox network began was that it didn't do any programming in the morning or in the afternoon. It was all primetime programming, with a couple of exceptions of trying to do late night stuff. But otherwise, everything was either primetime or it was sports. And I believe that daytime television is still a fairly profitable area, but now you're looking at it in a completely different light. You're looking at an abundance of things we've talked about: the courtroom shows, the syndicated game shows, syndicated reruns, and news. And those four things combined, I think, make up so much of what's going on in daytime programming. You have very few game shows. You have very little original television at all in terms of programming. Yes, NBC has been able to succeed in expanding the Today Show. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'll leave it to the viewers to determine. But you've got talk shows, you've got judge shows, you've got game shows, and you've got reruns, and you've got news. That just seems to be what goes on, and I can only guess that their money has to play a big part of it, because they're certainly inexpensive to put on. You've got network ownership of some of these syndication services. It's If anybody can hear that, we're having a thunderstorm here in Indiana right now. I was resisting the temptation to say that this was God passing his own commentary on the programming, but I think that between the economics of the situation and the ease with which you can fill daytime hours with this kind of thing, it just seems to be the way things are going. And I can't say that's a good thing either. I think that that it's a homogenization of television that has taken away a lot of character, good or bad, from the broadcast lineup.
Let's talk a little bit about news programs, especially the network news. It seemed to me that the last decade, this was when we had the Me Too movement rise up in the middle of the decade. You had people like Brian Williams got in trouble for uh, trying to make himself sound like Rambo when he was really just a newsreader. You had Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose being outed as total perverts. And that dominated it. And Again, long gone by this time was the big three of Rather, Jennings, and Brokaw, um, who were themselves inherited uh, a large population. And instead, we got David Muir, again, probably a nice guy, but a monotonous to me marionette or whatever you want to call it. I don't even know. I think Lester Holt was on NBC. Um,
I think you're right.
he might have been the best of them because he at least came from that era that there was still good journalism. And then wasn't there a woman who hosted CBS at the time? Now that long before CBS imploded. Um,
Yeah, you had both Katie Couric and then Nora O'Donnell most recently, but it's kind of like you can't even keep track of who's on CBS anymore.
Yeah, so but it does seem that a lot of these news programs were dominated by these mini scandals like Brian Williams is puffing up his resume
Yeah.
or the outings of these sexual antics. Um, where it's like what recourse did a viewer have? I mean, a lot of people, I guess, would just come home and watch it out of habit, but I guess the internet benefited from it.
Yep, habit is precisely it, I think, because we'd gotten into a habit of watching the evening news. But by the 2010s, with the rise of cable and the rise of cable news and the rise of the internet, you now have instant accessibility to TV news. You don't have to wait for the newspapers, and you don't have to wait for the network news. So when you're arriving at a point where the news is almost outdated by the time it comes on the network, you got to look for something else to be able to do. And I think that's why we've seen news expand into being more feature oriented, because you can tell stories and you can have features and at least have something that you're going to be able to offer the audience in the form of, what if it appeared in a magazine, you'd call it long form journalism. If on TV it becomes more touchy feely, but still what they're trying to do is find some kind of programming that that can continue to survive in an era of local news, not local news, instant news. So if all you're looking for is the news, you can turn on. You can even get the news on Fox. It's very hard to find, but you can get it. You can get it on MS Now. You can get it on CNN. If you want the news, you can go on X. You can go on any social media platform and get the news, and that's what most people are doing now. So in the teens, what you had was, I think, again, this is my opinion, you had an attempt to try to make the news relevant in part by getting the viewers to identify with the journalists themselves, the news readers. So Brian Williams has to have this certain ability to be able to reach through the screen and connect with the audience. That's why so often in both local and national news, you'll hear them talk about the stories that matter to us. It's not the stories that matter to you. It's the stories that matter to us, because we're all just one big happy. And so the personality of the newsreader becomes outsized, because you have to find a way for that reader to identify with the audience and vice versa. I think when that happens, when you turn them into celebrities, then you open the door for any kind of problem like this. Now, Peter Jennings, for instance, Peter Jennings was married and divorced several times. I don't care, because Peter Jennings was a terrific journalist and a terrific newscaster, but in a different era. That kind of stuff would have been big news, probably. We would have wondered, well, was Peter Jennings doing this, doing that? What was the inside story? It would have wound up on all the different tabloid shows. The same thing with we've joked about what's the frequency, Kenneth, and all these things with Dan Rather, and he took enough heat for it back then. Imagine what it would be like now. So I think that what the network news has tried to do is have the best of both worlds. They've tried to stay relevant, and they've tried to have a cult of personality surrounding their broadcasters, while at the same time trying to adjust to a more tabloid type of news, a more feature oriented type of news, a more if it bleeds, it leads type of news. Well, when you're going to turn your news people, when you're going to turn journalists into personalities, then they're going to become fair game for everybody else as well. Then you throw in as an added extra attraction the idea of news bias, whether real or imagined. And now all of a sudden you've got journalists out there with targets on their backs for one reason or another, from one special group or another. And so people are going to look to magnify whatever it is that they find out about somebody and make that into a big story. Quite frankly, I think that the news would be better served on TV if you had no idea who these people were, because then you would be all you'd have to do is depend on what they were saying. And who could name half of the news readers that were on headline news back in the day? Some of them were rather well known. Many of them were really good, but a lot of them were just there to read the news, and that's what you wanted, and that's what you got.
A more recent example of this in the negative sense is the thing that happened earlier this year with the newswoman Savannah Guthrie. Her elderly
Yes.
mother was kidnapped, and she took a beating online from these trolls that it was a psyop, or they was being done for this, for publicity or whatnot. Just terrible things. I vaguely heard of her name before. Her mother
Mhm.
was 88 years old, and I guess going through dementia. And I guess I don't know if it's been found. I don't know what resolution. I guess it's still an open
There
case.
hasn't been, yeah.
Yeah, and yet uh, the first reaction of people isn't sympathy. No matter how wacky Dan Rather might have been to a good portion of the population, if someone had found out that his wife had been kidnapped or whatnot 40 years ago, I'm sure most people have been sending
Yeah,
cards.
Dan Rather's harshest critics would have been the first ones out there saying that we're praying for Dan Rather's family and for Dan Rather, and if he needs anything and he can lean on us. I agree with you completely, and I think so. I think that you've got cultural factors that are coming in here too, in that everybody's a target, but that I think that completes the circle very nicely that we've talked about with news people. Once they turn into personalities, they become targets of whatever it is you want, because they have to sell the story, because the story isn't big enough itself, because you can already get it someplace else. So it becomes a vicious circle. And I know when we talked about the rise and fall of CBS a few months ago, that same kind of topic came up. Would CBS be the first network to get rid of its network news altogether? Now we've got a similar situation where CBS has gotten rid of its late night shows, and they're kind of, subleasing the time to Byron Allen's broadcast group. I just wonder when that time is going to come on network television too, where you get whether it's somebody like a Fox or a lesser known news station like News Nation, where one of the networks will just wind up going to them and saying, "Look, how would you like to produce a 30-minute 5 night a week newscast for us?" It would make as much sense.
Mm.
CBS could have hired Anderson Cooper to do the evening news and just done exactly what ESPN and ABC do with their sports coverage. You're now watching ESPN on ABC. You could just said you're now watching CNN on CBS. I think now we're getting kind of into that sociological thing again, but you've made a very prescient point about bringing it back to the 20 teens. This is when that kind of thing, I think, starts. It's when you see the predominance of the cable news, the 24/7 news cycle, and you can see the rise of the news personality, and inherently then the rise of the scandal culture within that. Because if you're going to make your people stars, then you're going to open them up to everything that might have excluded them in the past just because of their gravitas.
So I've got one more area I want to talk about, and then if you have any summary, you can close it. Let's talk about sports coverage in the 2010s. It seemed to me that of the big four North American sports, hockey remained minor. Baseball slowly declining again and again, drip, drip, drip. When you have the Kansas City Royals winning in the middle of that decade, I think it might be the smallest market. You had the NFL getting more and more bloated. And even the NBA even worse in terms of the players, and the quality of play started to slip. I mean, NBA players can't dribble it now without carrying or palming the ball.
Yeah,
But
no
the most
kidding.
interesting thing to me, I think, was the rise of the major indoor, not the major indoor soccer, the major soccer league,
Yep.
MSL,
MLS. Yeah.
MLS, Major League Soccer. Because I remember as a kid in the late '70s, you had the North American Soccer League with Pele and
Mm-hmm.
Giorgio Canali, and you had the Cosmos and the San Diego
Ah,
Sockers and
those were
what.
the days.
Yeah, and it then disappeared, and now we just had the World Cup this year. Um, Soccer seems to have be on a trajectory to maybe displace, knock hockey down to number five. Maybe even baseball will follow to number four in another 10, 20 years. Uh, what was your take on sports coverage in that decade, or anything that stuck with you?
A couple of things. I think you're right on the soccer. And what's most interesting about it is that the rise in soccer did not actually originate with domestic competition. It was international competition, or to be more precise, the English Premier League. I think that when the Premier League signed its big money contract with NBC, and all of a sudden NBC put regular English soccer, not the World Cup, not big tournaments, but the professional league over there, their equivalent of what the NFL might be like. When they started putting regular league games on broadcast TV, it became a sensation. All of a sudden, we found out how many fans of European soccer there were in this country, and they became, yeah, it became quite something. I mean, I personally am an Arsenal fan, so I was very happy with how the season wound up. But all of a sudden, these things are very accessible on television, and you're able to watch the games, you're able to follow them, you're able to learn about something brand new. And the funny thing about MLS is that I think you are right that MLS did help grow soccer in this country, but then it was superseded by international soccer, and not just the Premier League, but you had the Bundesliga, you had La Liga, you had the Serie A, you had the great stars like Lionel Messi, where you could watch them competing every week, or Cristiano Ronaldo. You could see them coming from games that were being played in Spain or Italy or France, and people began to get an appreciation of soccer as an international game. I think that is one of the big sports stories to come out of the late teens, was the growth of international as opposed to domestic soccer. The other thing that I think is interesting about that era is the revival of what we might call made for TV sports. Now, we talked about trash sports, usually one word, trash sports, but you'd have, whether you were talking about superstars or Battle of the Network stars or all these different things that were these made for TV concoctions. What I think about are things like the X Games. Once ESPN, which always pops up in these discussions, once ESPN transitioned from being being a televiser of sporting events to a producer of content. There's that word again. Once ESPN started making content and creating events to cover rather than simply covering what was out there, changed the whole landscape again. So you've got something like the X Games and then the Winter X Games, which popularize entirely different kinds of sports from what we're used to. The kinds of sports that you might have seen on Wide World of Sports back in the day, but now it's brought to a much higher level. You've got extreme sports. You've got marginal sports because again you've got to cover the whole cycle. So you've got the World Cornhole Championships, you have the hot dog eating contests, you have you have the ESPYs, you have all of these kinds of things that have become the reality TV of the ultimate reality program. There's no better kind of reality programming than sports. It is the ultimate in made for TV drama. And the drama of sports is what keeps people watching it. Now, even there, you've got a sub-genre of it. You have reality sports, which isn't really sports at all. It's just making the reality television part of sports bigger. You've taken pro wrestling, which always had outsized characters, again, going back to Gorgeous George that you've talked about, but you're taking the worst elements of wrestling and you're turning the athletes themselves into caricatures. You're getting into their private lives. You're turning them into soap opera characters, essentially. You're capitalizing on all of the scandals. You're doing all these different kinds of things. You're falling into the trap that basketball first fell into, which is that it's not a game about teams, it's a game about individuals. So when you've got LeBron James. Who the hell knows what team LeBron James is playing for anymore? You don't tune in to see the Lakers or the 76ers or the Heat or the Cavs. You turn in to see LeBron. Doesn't even have a last name, just LeBron. And you make stars out of a team sport, and it becomes a one-on-one competition. So you're doing the same thing that you did with the newscasters. I think sports is an incredibly big part of the story of the teens because you're seeing sports begin to be the only reliable form of television on the networks that people will tune into. And you're seeing it start to really take over the mainstream, but you're also seeing some of the worst traits of broadcast and cable television infiltrating sports as well, kind of an unholy alliance between sports and pop culture. And I've had the same thing happen to sports with me that I have with television. I used to be a rabid consumer of sports. I'd be able to sit here and tell you what was on every night, who these teams were, who the players were. I could talk you under the table with something like this. Now, I don't watch the NFL. I don't watch pro football. Don't watch baseball. Don't watch the NBA. Don't watch the NHL. Don't watch nearly as much soccer as I used to. Don't really watch. I watch auto racing. I can tell you a little bit about that, but not NASCAR because I live in Indiana. Obviously, I watch IndyCar. I used to watch Formula One before I would have had to buy an Apple TV subscription to watch it. So there are all these these different aspects. The worst part of television that has now become the worst part of sports as well. I guess we can't be surprised.
Well, yeah, I think, and I want the best example I think is MMA. Television has basically just distorted what sports is, and MMA started in the mid '90s, I think, and then wasn't until the 2010s that it took it took the thing in WWE that was interesting when you had the mic handlers like Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock and that whole attitude era of WWE where people could talk. MMA was a real sport like boxing, but once boxing went all the way in the early '80s with Sugar Ray Leonard and Roberto Duran, once that went to cable, it killed the sport because most people weren't watching it, so the
Yeah.
viewership went down, down, down. WWE went up in the '90s, but people got tired of the acrobatics. They wanted to see real blood. MMA gave them
Mhm.
real blood. They gave them the sports press conferences before the matches where guys would look each other and dick wave and sometimes fight each other for real. Um, And I have to say, I've never found MMA that exciting. I remember when Ronda Rousey became the women's champion, and hilariously, they were saying Ronda Rousey could beat what Floyd Mayweather, I think it was, and
Sure.
it's like it's ridiculous. It's one of those jump the shark moments, and
Yep.
to me, it's like MMA that that rose this at the same time soccer did. It's just a bizarre sort of pairing of the two sports that sort of rose up in that decade.
It is. And, I mean, even ESPN reports on pro wrestling now. Um, so again, I think that in sports, what happens when you shift from becoming an event coverage to programming content creator, that's when you enter into a conflict of interest with what you're doing that is eventually going to sink your boat if you're not careful. So sports, there's nothing to differentiate sports in the teens from anything else. It is a fascinating era. It's grim. It's depressing for guys like you and me. It is a depressing era, but as a cultural artifact of telling us what the 20s was going to become, the more I read about it, the more fascinating it became. You notice we haven't talked about shows much at all. We've talked about genres, we've talked about cinematography, we've talked a bit about stars, we've talked a lot about culture and society. We haven't talked about programs very much, less than we have in any other episode that I think we've done. That's what makes it tragic from one standpoint, but it's what makes it fascinating from the other, because this is all the talisman of what the 20s show that we're going to do is going to be like.
Yeah, it'll be just a weenie roast, I guess. But
Oh,
what's your final summation on this decade of the 2010s?
from a personal standpoint, it was completely forgettable. I don't think there was one show that other than Top Gear itself. There wasn't one show that I watched regularly from the 20 teens that debuted then. That was the only show that I discovered. Otherwise, it was Newton Minnow's Vast Wasteland for me. Again, as an experiment in what it means about sociology, it's fascinating. As entertainment, for me, it falls somewhere between depressing and completely insignificant.
Well, we'll end this show and come back with something more significant and uplifting, hopefully, for our next show in a
So,
month.
yeah. See
Thanks,
you then.
Mitch.